When they arrive in Chicago, it starts to snow. It's late afternoon and the sky is dim like dirty mop water. The air west of Lake Michigan and south of the bend in the Chicago River is alive with small stinging flakes that whirl about like confused whitewashed gnats. Newspapers and debris whip across Randolph Street in mini cyclones. At the station, the light has gone out in the big Greyhound bus sign. As they pass under it and into the subterranean depot, the sign rattles on the corner of the enormous granite building to which it's attached. What they say about Chicago is obviously true, Alec thinks. The wind here is no joke.
Adam, in your new novel, Wolf at the Table, we have this extraordinary synthesis of, on the one hand, a multi-generational family epic spanning 60 years in the life of the Larkins, this upstate New York Catholic family. And on the other hand, a really close look at crime and what becomes a story of a serial killer. I'd be curious to hear you talk about those points of inspiration for the novel.
Yeah, about 10 years ago, I was doing some research for a serial killer drama that I was considering to write as a television script. And I was reading and delving into the life of John Wayne Gacy, just on my own. I was going to write it on spec, as they say. In the midst of this, I received a box in the mail from my Aunt Roberta, who had sent me some of my mom's last effects. My mother passed away in 1997. And within it were some letters, there was a few personal items, and then one thing that was in it was my mom's nurse's badge. This work ID showed that she had been working until 1995. It dawned on me as I was doing the John Wayne Gacy inquiry that he was executed in May of '94, and he was executed at the prison where my mom worked. I made a few calls and I found out that she was actually on duty, and very likely was the nurse who performed his final physical so that they could do the chemistry correctly for his lethal injection. And that really, really freaked me out and made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Partly just because of the randomness. It was something that she never shared with me or my brother and sister. But also because my mom's life was so interestingly innocent in so many ways. She was the oldest of 13 in a large Catholic family. She was born and raised in Elmira, New York, and then moved to the Midwest in Illinois when she was 8 years old. We grew up in Joliet, Illinois, which is about 35 minutes south of Chicago and about 45 minutes south of where Gacy committed all those murders. I was haunted by that for the rest of my adult life. I remember being a kid in the Joliet area and being told not to get in any vans that any man would invite you into. There was just a specter of this horrible atrocity that traveled down from the North Shore where he lived down to where we were. And I think that's why I wanted to write about it. And at that same time, I got this shoebox. Like, how is it possible that this woman could come into such close proximity to, in this case, Gacy? Also reminded of some anecdotal stuff that I learned from my mom's sister and also her friend Gloria, that she lived in the building next, maybe even lived in the actual building, I'm not sure about this, but that where the nurses were murdered by Richard Speck in 1966. That and the Gacy story just seemed crazy to me. I was really taken with that idea, and I felt like the container of that story was much, much larger than a television idea. It felt like it wanted to be a longer, more longitudinal approach for a narrative, and it felt like a novel to me. An hour later, in a kind of trance, Myra crosses the Ohio River and pulls into an all-night diner in rural Kentucky, just outside Paducah. Before she goes inside, she takes in the river, whose surface is oddly smooth, like obsidian, as if she could take her shoes off and walk out into the middle and wait for some strange being to appear and advise her about the next phase of her life. She looks at the map under the dome light of her pacer. She could keep going south. The cities are staggered downward toward the Gulf of Mexico like a series of provocations. She could just keep driving and driving until dawn. She could take a quick nap in Memphis and still be in New Orleans before noon. She could watch the sun dapple the skin of Lake Pontchartrain. She could start her life over there. She could disappear just as Denny did 6 years ago. She could change her name and find a little carriage house and grow old and anonymous and unwitnessed. No more worries about Ronan or groceries or booster shots or parent-teacher conferences or showing up at the dingy hospital where children get abandoned and suffered and die all too often. She is briefly thrilled by this prospect, this possibility of shape-changing into something she's never known herself to be. She could start writing or take up watercolor painting. She could work at a used bookstore and speak with a strange accent. She could become promiscuous. She could paint the trim on her carriage house a vibrant electric yellow. Her garden would be shaggy and strange. She would grow misshapen heirloom tomatoes and keep bees in the backyard. Inside her house, she would walk around naked and seldom shower and let her armpit hair grow out and sleep on extravagant pillows. She would start smoking hashish and listen to Joni Mitchell and read John Cheever stories and the novels of Toni Morrison and Joyce Carol Oates. But as the wipers clear away the rain, these thoughts start to disappear as if they were written with her finger on the windshield. She can only see her son, Ronan, running around a cinder track, his long coppery hair lifting off his shoulders, his searching hazel eyes, which he inherited from her, his boyish arms that will be marked with mosquito bites in a couple of months, his pale, oddly muscular calves. She shifts the car into drive and eases back onto the highway. She's made a decision. She will not flee her life. She will return to her small unit on the third story of 2421 Ingalls Avenue, building number 6 of Cedarwood Apartments, where on the floor beside her bed, her sleeping son will be curled anxiously into himself, awaiting her loving hand.
So I think one thing that's fascinating to readers about writers is how does that creation process happen? Where does the invention start when you have yourself, your mother, these people that you're building from, but then you're just inventing other things out of whole cloth? Do you feel when and how that invention starts happening for you when you're creating a story?
Yeah, it's a really tricky thing because I pride myself in not using my life often, and I find that my life is not as interesting as something that I can make up. So Ronan in particular and Myra Lee in particular, I think are as close to, I guess, a version of myself when I was in my early 20s and living in the East Village and having moved here from the Midwest and falling in love with theater as a complete surprise, not having any training, having been an athlete. Ronan was a track athlete, I was a basketball player. There's a lot of correlations that feel really familiar, but I wasn't ready to fall in love in the way that he does in the book, and I wasn't a particularly good son. He's a very dutiful son. He's an only child. He's really a work of fiction, but it feels incredibly familiar. He does live where I set his apartment, and the East Village is based on my apartment that I lived in for 31 years. The blocks he walks are the blocks that I walked to work when I first worked in book publishing. And while I was writing him, I will say that when he fell down at times and struggled, I could really feel his struggle personally. So the fact that it was jacking up my nervous system to write about him was probably a good thing, and I didn't want to shy away from it. So that's for Ronan. For Myra Lee, I think she's closer to who my mother was. And she's, in some ways, it was me reimagining moments of her life and then dramatizing those, like how she met my father, which was in a laundry room in the building in Chicago they both lived in and where they met. That's how they had their first encounter. Like, I actually dramatized that in the novel. I don't know the dialogue that happened between them. I don't know what really was said or what really passed between them, but I was able to invent that, knowing my mom and thinking about what she might have said. And, you know, in some ways, Myra Lee is an homage to my mom. And that's scary. It's not me just inventing and looking down as the kind of omnipotent force of the author, like puppeteering. It feels more like I'm actually dealing with hearts and souls that I already know. And I hope that some of the cases in this novel, I hope that those things feel authentic. I hope that's the result of that.
Well, it's so interesting that you talk about moments and time, because one of the fascinating things about this novel is the way it deals with the macro and the micro. We've talked about the macro, that we're covering about 60 years, but the micro is that each chapter in the novel covers only a 24-hour period of time. So we might move forward a few years, but then it's just one day in the life of a character or characters in the novel. When did that notion of how you would use time to tell the story occur to you, and how did you realize that that would be the effective way to do it?
I knew that the first chapter was going to take place in one day, and I knew that it started to feel like it was going to be a more longitudinal story with a greater history. And I thought, instead of sitting in chapters for a very long period of time, what would be interesting for the reader is to feel a very compressed, concentrated amount of time where decisions are made, consequences are felt, characters are making good and bad choices. If I could contain that within 24 hours, it might add a nice counterpoint to this larger expanse of time that's happening. As a playwright, I'm often, early in my career especially, I was writing plays in real time where you would, like, the play would be an hour and a half of this person's life on this particular night, and maybe Act 2 was another hour on another evening 2 years later. And so I felt like I could kind of lean into those skills that I had developed to try to create this compressed feeling of one day. In drama, they say, what makes this day more important than any other day? And I kept trying to remind myself of that as I move further into the novel. Like, why is this day important? And if I couldn't answer that, then it didn't deserve to be written. Once I got, to chapter 2 and 3, I realized, I'm doing this, and I'm gonna just stay with that formula. And I will say this, I also gave myself the option of breaking the formula if I had to, but I didn't want. I found I was taking great pleasure in that assignment. In the center of the terminal at the circular kiosk, a man with well-groomed, lubricated hair parted on the side is studying Alec. He has intense, unblinking gray eyes and a clean-shaven, portly face. He wears a white painter's jacket too thin for the weather and baggy canvas carpenter's pants. He looks like a man who scoops ice cream, improbably out of time and season. You lost? The man asks Alec. No, he says. You act like you are. I'm in Chicago and this is the Greyhound station, Alec says. If I'm somewhere else, please tell me. You need a ride someplace? You got a cab? I got a car. It's got gas in it and the heat works. Where are you going?
We talked about Gacy. He appears in the novel as a character, and that it was surprising to you that the brother Alec and his encounter with Gacy is one of the things that suddenly shocked you and sent the novel in a new direction.
Yeah, I knew that Alec was going to have an interaction with Gacy, and I knew that he was going to have an interaction in an earlier chapter with this character Duke, who was a mentor of his, who would turn out to be surprisingly extremely violent and winds up murdering this old lady who runs a kind of a consignment variety shop. What you think is going to be a robbery turns out to be a grisly murder, and Alec witnesses that from his mentor and then has this very close call and kind of an entertaining evening with Gacy, who chooses not to kill him. I didn't know how extreme it was going to go after the Gacy encounter that he has, but I felt like naturally the inevitability of the story kept pulling me toward the darkest place, and I felt like I had to follow that.
And I think one of the things that compels people or fascinates them, even in a dark way, about serial killers, it's just that why, trying to get into the mind of and understand this character. And so that was something you had to do here. And the novel doesn't shy away from facing that darkness, but it tries to do it in a way where we're not going to reduce this to only pure evil. It is evil, but we're also going to try to understand the humanity of it. So I'm just curious, versus the familial stuff,
Yeah.
like what it was like to try to get in that and write from that.
Yeah, the portrait of Alec, who becomes the serial killer in the family. It was important for me to think about what was broken in him, what was damaged as a child, who failed him in some regard, who left him hanging when he needed help. He had some bad mentors, some bad examples that somehow committing those crimes and these horrible murders of these young boys would give him peace, and that becomes compulsive, and that becomes repeated, for years. So I feel like it was really important to draw out those moments where you might even feel sorry for him and have pity for him. If you don't have that, then I don't think the extreme of the other side can exist.
One of the really provocative questions that the novel asks is, what would you do if you had a killer in your own family? It pushes this notion of both personal responsibility and familial responsibility to the extreme and puts the reader in that really tough position. I'm curious, as you were writing, and a couple of the characters in the novel do eventually learn this horrific, poisonous secret in the family as these ominous postcards start showing up at the house. Confronted with this knowledge, they have a decision to make. What will they do? What will they not do? How did you think about that?
Yeah, I felt like once the knowledge came forth about what he was doing, and they kind of cracked the code of what he was doing, it was important to put them across the table from each other. And there's a scene in which she finds him at a diner after doing some sleuthing in his town of Eureka Springs, and she confronts him, and she's just gotten through her third round of chemotherapy, and she's struggling physically and barely could stay awake during the train trip. And then she has a rental car, and she really makes this enormous effort to find him, and her whole job is to confront him, and she's morally put herself in this position, and ultimately she doesn't entirely succeed in stopping him, which I think she hopes to do. One thing I was interested in that particular moment, which actually you are the one who encouraged me to write that chapter, I found nothing in life, we may have great aspirations and inspirations for moments like that, but rarely do they come off in the way that we want them to. It's far more complex. He was her little brother. If she calls the cops, she puts him in prison forever. It's so much more complicated than just like finding a man in his midlife who's a monster. And I thought it would be easy to land the chapter with him being taken away in handcuffs and his head being pushed under a police vehicle threshold. I thought it would be far more interesting to see how she struggles with it and ultimately fails in some way.
We've touched on mental illness a couple times, and we see what happens with Alec when he may have some form of mental illness, doesn't get help. We see another track going with Myra Lee, where she marries Denny, who becomes the father to her son Ronan. Denny suffers from a severe mental illness. Ronan inherits this mental illness from him. We see later with Ronan a situation which could have gone horribly wrong that he manages to avert. And then eventually we see Ronan's son, Bruce, also inheriting this mental illness, but getting help from his parents. How much was it important to you to be examining that as a thread?
It was something I was very conscious of. I wanted to, what is the legacy of madness? Whether it's the madness Alec experiences halfway through his life or into his adulthood, or the madness that besets, I guess, Ronan at a pretty young age, and then his son at an even younger age. What is that strand, and who is it? Hereditary? Is it learned? Is it? I think in the case of Ronan and his son Bruce, it's hereditary, and I think Ronan inherited that from his father. His father is schizophrenic, who has sort of psychotic breaks with reality that landed him in an institution, and Ronan struggles with some of that and overcomes it and gets on the right cocktail, and he has access to that and he has resources for that. And then we see the love and attention he gives to his son when he sees his son starting to have little tremors of that. In fact, not even a tremor, a full-blown episode at the end of the novel when his son is, I think, 11 years old. I was just interested in like the dynamics of that in the family, the dynamics of that in the culture. Like we are a hugely mentally ill culture, you know, like all of us struggle in some regard with some form of something. And I feel like it's in our daily conversations, you know, many of us are in therapy, many of us are on psychoactive medication, and I felt like it's something so pervasive, I couldn't really not write about it. And personally, it's in my life, and I felt like it was something that haunted me enough and that I was thinking about enough that I felt like I needed to like figure out a way to weave it into the novel.
Although the novel looks head on at this darkness, and in particular, these killings and the family's eventual effort to reckon with it, a truly remarkable achievement is that by the end, it finds its way to some hope, some light, some redemption. And I'm curious how you managed to find your way there by the end of the novel, and what you hope readers take away from it when they finish.
Yeah, the novel used to end in a very hopeless, brutalist sort of way. And after actually talking to you about that, we talked about that at length, and I really felt strongly after our conversation that after investing 450 pages or so, or whatever it is, that to just leave the reader alone in a basement with the light off and it's really cold, that might be too easy. Not that it's not valid, but maybe it's just too easy, you know. And I felt like a more complicated ending is the sort of portrait of a family that's mid-struggle, but part of that struggle is they're trying hard and loving each other and providing hope for each other in some regard, and that's what we're left with. And I feel like that was a richer way to end the book for me, and I hope for the reader. I hope that's what they walk away with, is just this feeling of like, yeah, it's dark out there, and we have a lot of problems in our world and in our families and in our bedrooms, but like we can still toil to love and toil to like help each other in some regard. So that felt more honest to me ultimately. They exit up the long escalators leading to the street level. Jack politely yields at the foot of the escalator and lets Alec go ahead of him. During the 4-block walk to Jack's car, the snow is almost blinding. The wind skirls between the buildings like a hungry animal left on a hill. Alec pulls up the collar of his peacoat and squints hard as the snow pelts his eyelashes and forehead. "Is the snow always this crazy here?" he shouts. "This ain't even half of it," Jack replies, seemingly immune. He's not even wearing a hat. "In about 2 hours, it'll feel like Siberia."